we have a whole fun thing planned tonight. I'm gonna start off with the doodle that I originally did. If you're getting tired of drawing the same pose of just guy standing, staring at camera, holding up peace sign, this is the stream slash video for you. I want to say all of these are like generalized tips, and that not even most artists do all of these in every single piece every single time. So this is not like a if you do this you're bad at art. This is like a if you feel like you've been stuck drawing the same pose over and over again, here's a few different ways that you can get out of feeling stiff. This is so that you can diversify your palette if you want to, but if you aren't happy with what you're doing, that's fine. This is just there for you if you need it. The first tip that I really want to give is like to plan for your canvas. And by that, I mean, you don't have to draw exactly on the canvas that you want to do like right away. You don't have to be like, okay, I'm going to do a square canvas. I'm going to do a rectangle canvas. I know exactly the pixel size that I want to do for this. But what it does mean is give yourself a lot of space to draw, and don't be scared to chop off parts of what you're drawing if you wind up wanting to make a crop that makes your piece look better. So for example, let's just actually take peace sign guy again, because I think that this is a really good example. While I would say different canvases benefit different poses differently, just regular like rectangle canvas for this leaves a lot of white space up here and leaves things feeling kind of empty. So if you were to do more like this kind of canvas where you do a piece of paper, the white space gets more evenly distributed to over the tails. You don't need to know right away. Drawing it out first and then cropping your canvas after can really help, which goes into my next point, framing and cropping. Someone was asking like, how do you make your pieces with no background feel so lively? Don't feel locked into having your character's ground plane be the bottom of your canvas. And by that I mean, don't feel like the feet have to be like the bottom of the canvas, like where things have to end. Rotating your art at an angle can sometimes help an otherwise stiff pose fill out a canvas. And also, don't be scared to crop out parts of your drawing. It's why it's good to decide framing from your sketch phase and experiment so you don't lose hard work in rendering. So we could do two examples of this really quick with just standing still guy. If we were to do just a very simple rectangle, the humble rectangle, you could rotate it so that critter is like this, and it would be very silly, but there's nothing wrong with it. And in a way, this kind of fills out the canvas more. Although, looking at this now, you could even do like a square canvas. So then it's not a full body, but it is, on the other hand, something that fills out the canvas and has kind of like a nice diagonal motion to it. Alternatively, if you were just going to do a crop without any of the angle rotation, you could do something along these lines, where you have just one tail like that. Which is just very funny. It's kind of comedic almost because of how silly the face is drawn and just like the single tail. But it's like there are ways to make even like a stiff pose kind of interesting. Which brings us to point 3. This is where we actually start redrawing the pose. Even after all of that, the character still feels a bit floaty. And that's because we haven't taken any time to account for our ground plane or the environment in which the character is standing at. And I know that the whole point of this is to teach you how to draw poses in a white void or with no background, but the thing is, even in pieces with no background, you can still imply an environment. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to draw the ground plane or draw the objects in the room or anything like that. It just means that your characters have to occupy some sort of space. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to just make a little grid of whatever plane they would be standing on and then draw them standing in that grid space. For starting out, I would suggest drawing a grid, but it's not necessary. And after a while, you'll be able to do most of this stuff without having to do guidelines. It's just good to get in the practice. I think it's funny we started with the peace sign pose. I kind of want to keep doing a peace sign pose just because I want to prove that it's not the pose that you're doing, it's just like the way that you're doing it. This is kind of a rough example, but what this does, especially by including a drop shadow, is you are implying the character's kind of like weight in the environment that they take up. So as compared to this, where the feet are kind of just flat on the floor looking at us straight ahead, the feet here look like they're actually grounded on something that's material and like real. Even if you were to take the ground plane away, while it's still very cartoony looking, it at least grounds critter in some real space, so we can see like the idea of where they're meant to be, even if there's no background. Ground plane can be as simple as just making sure you figure out how your character's feet would lie and like where it is that they're standing while facing you, or not facing you, but Character weight is something completely different. Character weight is like what leg your character is putting their weight into. And this can come from a bunch of different things. This can come from a character's body weight. This can come from a character's stance. It can come from, are they holding something heavy? Are they falling? Are they like peeking towards you? Are they eking away? And there's a lot of very like simple ways that you can do this, but one of my favorite is just the lean. The lean is essentially just your character is taking all of their weight from their body and leaning it on a back kind of kickstanded back foot, kind of like a bike kickstand, and another foot is still touching the ground, but it's touching the ground ever so slightly in a way that's kind of just casually like there. Like they're putting it down to not have only one foot on the ground, but it's not really taking a lot of the weight like the other one is. I'm actually going to use the tails to counterbalance some of the weight, because if Critter was leaning onto this foot and putting a lot of their body weight onto this foot, they wouldn't be able to have a tail on the side of their body because it would kind of tip them over. I think their other tail would come around here, kind of like underneath the other one, like snaking underneath. So instead of just being stood, they're kind of using their tails to counterbalance the weight of leaning onto this one foot. All of Critter's weight is going into this foot here, so they're kind of like leaning over. I would say if I had to give them a line of action, which is our next point, their line of action is kind of like this. So the next point that I have is to push it and use line of action. One of the easiest ways that I found to do this is to take this original concept you had for a pose and try to simplify it into shapes and forms, like the simplest shapes and forms you can possibly do. The reason that we do this and what this is called is a gesture sketch, because it captures the energy of the pose that you're trying to go for. It will take the most important fundamental pieces of the pose and kind of like exaggerate them, and then once you've done a few gesture sketches, you can take your favorite and then draw over it to get your new pose. I think something that's important to think about when you do gestures too is just like the shape you're going for. This is where you use these secondary features like the ears or tail or even the hair of a character, if you have a character that has like long hair, to really accentuate the direction that you want for the piece. I really want to have Critter like clear that it's putting a lot of weight. I feel like I can push this more than I'm doing. No, actually, I feel like I've done it less now. I think maybe that we just stick with this, because I think if I try to do it anymore, I'll lose something. There's more depth from this angle, yeah! And like, I feel the weight is distributed more evenly. It's still not as perfectly pushed as I feel like I could do if this was a character that had like plantigrade legs, because the kind of Pokemon adjacent like legs are a little harder to do dramatized poses with, but I think that this is pretty solid for what we started with. With depth and foreshortening, this section goes hand in hand with pushing a pose and implying a ground plane or like a point of view by having elements of your piece be farther away and closer to the viewer, and otherwise static pose can be given some depth. Actually, we're gonna bring back just regular peace sign critter for a moment, and I'm gonna show you how just this standing pose, you can give a little sauce to it just by using foreshortening, and it doesn't take much at all. Two things that you can do. One, you could just have the thing be in front of the other thing, and that's a pretty good start. And you have to make it bigger. That's the other thing. It has to be bigger, because the closer things are, the larger they will appear. But also, what I'm doing here, make the line art thicker. If you use line art, or if you're a renderer, like you're a painter, the closer something is, typically the more saturated the color will appear, or the more in shadow it'll appear. That's about playing with your lighting and like what you're doing. But there are many ways to differentiate when an object is close or far away, and using little tricks like that can add a lot of depth to your piece. Something else you can do is when something is meant to be farther away, you can change the line color of it to be lighter. So let's say that these tails are kind of falling back into the image because they're behind critter. Already, you're getting a little bit of depth to this piece. We are going to redraw this pose again, but using the foreshortening. Alright, but I think that is all that we're gonna do for this one. And I have to say, this looks pretty solid. So the same pose with a little foreshortening, and I did change the positioning of the tails, but like, already you're kind of starting to get some of the depth from this pose. I love how the color is darker as it gets closer. Yeah, and you can do either, but I find that darkness as it comes closer kind of implies a distance that light doesn't. It works either way though. So the last bullet point that I had, using environmental flare, essentially. Actually, let's put it this way. Implied environmental flare. This sounds a little confusing, but bear with me here. Just because you don't have a background in this piece doesn't mean you can't imagine the space in which this takes place. So for example, since Critter has these paintbrush tails, we could have Critter splattering some paint with their tails. In doing so, we can create kind of like a natural framing for our piece out of just some things that are going to be in the environment already because of who the character is. It's just like a really tiny way you can add a little bit of like spice to your drawing without having to do like a whole rendered background, and also kind of like beef out your framing and stuff like that. So let's fill in some of these little speckles. All right, there we go. That's more of a circular movement. Man, that really does like fill out the piece. The original versus the final of the same pose.